Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about the slight delay. When the Kurdish issue is being talked about, you often hear the sentence of the Kurds being the largest people without a state. And that seems to be holding true even within the University of Manchester, even within University Place, because we have a very firm booking with the central timetabling unit for University Place 6.206, which is next door. But when we arrived for setting up, it had already been occupied. So we find ourselves a people without a territory, but luckily we could find another one into which we moved, and hopefully no further invaders will appear driving us out from here, having gone through all the elaborate processes of setting up the filming. And the filming brings me to, first of all, to introduce myself. Most of you obviously already know me. My name is Oliver Bast. I'm a senior lecturer in Middle Eastern history in the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures here at the University of Manchester. But I'm also, together with my colleague Siyavush Ranjbardo-Emi, the director, or the co-director in that case, of the Manchester Iranian History Academic Network. And it is this, the Manchester Iranian History Academic Network, which is organizing today's talk. And I would like to invite you to have a look at our website, which is up there, mihan.org.uk. You can also very easily go and just see mihan.uk and find further information about MIHAN and also further events like this one that will take place. Our events are often filmed, sometimes streamed live over the internet, and the legacy lives on our MIHAN YouTube channel, which you can get access to up here, and you can re-watch some of our activities easily there. In the autumn we had a very interesting panel about the Battle of Chaldiran of 1514, which had its 500th anniversary in the year 2014. One of our Ottomanist colleagues, Dr. Imber, is amongst us here today, who participated in that. And we had other talks as well, and we will continue in that field. So please go and have a look what MIHAN does. Go to our Facebook site, like us, and be automatically informed about what is going on. Now, tonight, it gives me great pleasure to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Walter Posch, who joins us from Vienna, where he works at the National Defense Academy of the Austrian Army, Austrian Federal Army, as an expert of Middle Eastern affairs. But Walter is not only an expert of contemporary Middle East, with a particular focus on the area that is of interest to the Manchester Iranian History Academic Network. He is also a renowned historian of the early modern Middle East, if you want to use that term, early modern, concerned with the relations between the Ottomans and the Safavids. So he could have been here with us as well if it would have been the 500th anniversary of the Battle of Chaldiran. So Walter is one of those people who bestride with great ease at the same time the world of the Ottomans and the Turkish or Turkic worlds, if you like, as well as what one might call the Persianate world. So he's at home in both these worlds, and within that sort of realm, of course, falls what one might call Kurdistan, which is our topic today. Walter has published in the area of contemporary affairs. He, for a period of time, served in Paris at the Wilson Institute. He then was also in Berlin at a think tank of the German Chancellery, and has now gone back to where he came from, namely the National Defense Academy in Vienna. He has also recently published a major study of Ottoman Safavid relations, covering the wars at that time, which is a work that we have all been waiting for. Colin will be able to confirm that. And this work will also hopefully very soon be able in English for those colleagues amongst us that can't access the German in which it exists at the moment. So tonight Walter will turn his attention to the very same area where these wars raged in the 16th century and give us a historical perspective on those burning questions that are on our television screens every night these days concerning the battle with ISIS or Daesh, and the situation of the Kurds and all of that as it has arisen. And therefore, without further ado, I would like to invite Walter to give us his thoughts on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oliver. It's very kind from you. What I try to do now is to underpin a little bit what my day-to-day work is currently, namely analyzing the ongoing crisis within the Kurdish groups, with Kurdish groups in all the countries, with a little bit history. It will not be a history-less lecture, I'm afraid, but I think it is worthwhile. And then I try to end with an outlook of what could be potentially a development. And in between I will put the focus on two main Kurdish actors, on one being the KRG and one being the PKK, because I think it's an understudied and under-debated topic. Because in usual parlance, diplomats, people who work in office, oh yes, I have to mention this, views are mine only, so it's not to be related with the general staff of the Austrian army or with the Austrian government. It's my personal scholarly view and I'm free to talk about it, but in my personal academic capacity I have to do this disclaimer, I'm sorry. When people who stand in public life or are diplomats, scholars, spokespersons for governments, high military figures talk about the Kurds, they never mention the term Kurdish question. It's always the Kurdish issue. Why is the Kurdish issue not the question? Because we have a pedigree of an important diplomatic question, the so-called Eastern question, where it was the question was about when the Ottoman Empire will be dismembered, who will get what chunk of it, where will be what nation state to emerge, what would be the territory. Now, simply coining the Kurdish, it as Kurdish question would be understood, if spelled by a diplomat or an official, as an intention of a power or an influential country or an institution like the EU, that they are already planning and take it for granted that there is a Kurdish state to be created. I see, as of now, nobody to go that far. I don't see it, not in an official capacity, and they're still, even in private, very careful in what they are talking. So the usual term is the Kurdish issue. And an issue it is, it cannot be ignored. It has been important in, as a domestic factor for three very important Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, Iran and Turkey, to a lesser degree, and now, but also very important, to Syria. And it has always been a topic of debate among experts, although for a while it was not that center stage. However, I think we can accept the fact that there is clearly Kurdish national aspiration of any kind. The Kurds feel a bond of unity. those who criticize these movements, groups and so on, would say that they are split along ethnic and sectarian lines, that their history doesn't add up, that's a diverse geography, and that there is no international consent about actually a creation of a Kurdistan. Now, these arguments are as true as they are false, because if you read, say, Austrian papers from the early 19th centuries, they would say Italy is just a geographic entity and there is no bond of common culture unifying. Everybody was up to the mid-19th century sure that the Germans will never be able to unite because they're just so diverse, and they are coming back from Berlin after 5 years. I can tell you about the big diversity and differences between northern and southern Germans. Is there a vision? Yes, I would say there is, but let us look at the facts. It is true, Kurds are divided linguistically, and the linguistic argument cannot be pushed aside simply because Kurds claim it as a legitimization factor. Fact is, when you once start to claim linguistics, you have to go down the road, and then you can end up with the fact that Zaza, the very northern Kurdish, is linguistically more close to Gilak and other Muslim Caspian languages than it is to Kermanshi. Kermanshi, on the other hand, and Sorani are quite different, and then we have the Kalhor and Goran dialects or languages scattered around, which are independent on their own. They are related clearly, but they are different. It depends then on politics what you make out of it, what you stress. Not to be able to comprehend and to understand one another, just think that the Platt German and the lower and the Bavarian German does not mean that you cannot form a nation. It depends on political will, it depends on identity, it depends on a code of mores and traditions, and you can say that these obstacles can be overcome if there is a movement, if there is will. But still, it is something, as Benedict Anderson would tell you, as any nation, it's an invention, it's an act of will, first and foremost. And when I use the term national, then I start with this act of will of a certain elite, as it was the case with the transfer from Ottoman Empire to modern Turkey, where also there was the will to create a Turkishness and a Turkish identity, regardless from the ethnic stock of the population. There are other diverting lines within the Kurds. They are, of course, differentiated in confessional terms. Most of them are Shafi Sunnis, but with a huge amount of Hanafis, especially in Turkey. We find Shiites, Alawis of any sort, Ahle Haq and so on, minority sects, people which are usually regarded to be in the margins of the religious spectre, and of course famous now groups like the Yazidi. And here again, we cannot ignore these questions without any prejudice. When you see the debate within the Yazidi community, whether actually they are Kurds or have a separate identity, you see that these questions of identity are not sorted out yet. This is important, and it will lead us directly to today's situation. One of the main arguments put forward was that to say that the Kurds have no history, there was never a political Kurdistan, and there was never a unified emperor of Kurdistan, even if you take Salahuddin Ayyubi, who then was ruling over more than only Kurdistan, the famous Sultan Saladin. That is both true and wrong. If you compare and take a snapshot from the early 16th century, if you compare the fragmentation of Georgia with the fragmentation of Kurdistan and the tribal areas of the Arabs in southern Iraq, you would say you can read all these issues as either elites fighting or tribal or certain regions being quasi-autonomous. But the difference is, I would say, that in Georgia you had the fiction and the idea and the memory of a unified kingdom, and all the titles the Georgian princes used were titles given to them symbolically in the name of the king, which was of the paramount king, which was not existing any longer. We don't have a situation like this in Kurdistan, so there was no defined, even imaginary legal entity like a unified Kurdistan, and still, as a geographic term, as an ethnographic term, it existed, and it existed also in a clear political way, namely in the way that local dynasties were not only just local and scattered princes somewhere, but could build up small statelets with quite a sizable influence, which has been ignored, of course, by the historical writing of, say, the Ottomans and the Safavids. Let's go to the famous Battle of Chaldiran in 1514. Before that and around that, more important than the outcome of this was the diplomacy around it, with Idrisi Bitlis, a Kurdish scholar from Bitlis. He could convince a group of Kurdish princes to join the Ottomans, and what they got in exchange was, and this was really given by Ottoman law, was the confirmation of their status, namely that they would nominate their heirs. They could give up, hand over so-called ocaklık, that means hereditary seats. The Ottomans had another kind of management of their realm. So they confirmed the local elites, and they confirmed them because they were Kurdish. This came appeared very clearly when I was reading some of the Ottoman documents where, for instance, the arrangement was where Kurdish notables would criticize the appointment of a Cherkess in their region because this is Kurdistan and there only should be Kurds, with the exception of some Ottoman troops. Ardalan and Shahrizor would be another example of a principality around the area roughly of what later became Suleymaniye, the modern city of Suleymaniye, where you could see that the local, quite powerful prince, being somewhere in between the Ottomans and the Safavids, could maintain power and build up culture. Running libraries, having administration on his own, tax system, a standing army of sorts. The same accounts for Bitlis. A lot of elites from the 16th centuries, if you take elites from the 16th centuries, where Bitlis came from Bitlis. There's a famous story about, unfortunately unconfirmed, some librarian of the Ottoman Sultan who was from Bitlis, so a backwater perhaps, but people able to have so much education that people could join the palace. And of course, the Ottomans did not question for until the 19th century the importance and the independence of the Kurdish princes. When we remember that the ruling family of Bitlis went over to Iran, and then they returned back to the Ottoman Empire 100 years later. And this was only natural for the Ottomans to accept their legal claim on their old territory. The family exists, I guess, to this day under the name of Şerefettin Han, of course without any power. And in all Ottoman Safavid dealings, the management of the border, the so-called Serhat, which ran after one roughly along the area where it is now. In all treaties like the Qasr al-Shirin or Sohab Treaty, there are references about the Kurds, about claims and loyalties, which Kurdish tribe or entity would belong to which sovereign's realm. And this is a situation which basically continued until the 19th century, until the big Tanzimat, and even later on, if you remember, where Kurdish notables play an important role in a way until this day. I would say two events were very important. One is in the beginning of the 19th century, the Principality of Botan, which almost made an important political impact. They were were conducting an uprising, but Kurdish nationalists, not without reason, compare what has been built up there in this southeastern area of modern Turkey was already very similar to what at the same time, a certain Tepetelen Ali Pasha created in Greece. A functioning administration, a claim on a territory, still more on his own, but this principality in Greece managed to produce the first bureaucrats in the Greek language, and a similar tendency, at least this is what some scholars say, existed in Botan. And towards the end of the 19th century, with Sheikh Obeidullah and his uprising, a combination of Islam and modern nationalist thinking occurred already. Modern nationalist thinking has been, of course, in competition with the Armenian, especially in Turkey. Usually people say, usually the agreement or the standard view is that Kurds a little bit are latecomer to modern European nationalism. Be it as it may, I don't think it really explains everything. Fact is that the Kurdish consciousness is there, has history, and even if the claim of, say, a Kurdish empire or country or whatsoever cannot be underpinned with something like Kurdish unity, one already can make the point that the Kurdish consciousness and a territorial sense of Kurdistan existed, with, of course, shifting borders, but coming from Central Europe, I can tell you we got used to shifting borders, and that's why I rather a normal issue than an exception. Not everybody's on an island. Throughout the 20th century, I think I don't have to mention too much. Here again, it's the question of the Kurdish issue. Kurds tried to represent themselves in Sèvres. Dr. Shirkuh and others tried to promote the idea of an independent Kurdistan. It was debated at Sèvres at the peace conference. There has been a myth around that the Treaty of Sèvres would guarantee an independent Kurdistan, but if you go and read the text, this was kind of a polite way to say no, not an independent Kurdistan, but basically, if we think it necessary, we're going to take care about your nationalism, basically, if you want to intervene. The article was very ambiguous, and it was by far no guarantee for anything and no promise for anything, but formulated in a way, as diplomats do, that it's ambiguous enough. And I've been then counting, when do I read, did I read the last time an official paper from a significant power using the word Kurdistan in something like a diplomatic context. It starts, the last one is the Peace Treaty of Sèvres, where the word Kurdistan is explicitly mentioned. But then we come into the Iraq of Saddam Hussein, where the UN mentions, where UN resolution mentions first Kurdish inhabited areas. Here again, avoid the term Kurdistan, and then it was in around 2000.
Could you just give us the dates, because there's some need.
Sèvres was 20 or 21?
1920. Yeah.
1920. And the UN resolution was from 1991. So you see a whole century there are no Kurds on the international political arena, unless, of course, and it was not an outspoken taboo, but this was something where you would not meddle, you would not care too much on the level of a government. People would be conscious. People would know about. The Americans were very well aware about Soviet propaganda among the Kurds in the 1950s and tried to build up already Voice of America in Kurdish Sorani especially and Kermanshah, and the Turks intervened against this. But this again is not a real diplomatic recognition or a policy towards an entity called Kurdistan or even towards Kurdish right. This was about how to challenge better Radio Yerevan, which had a sizable influence especially on the Kurds of Turkey. Having said this, it was then in the 2000s when people would freely use diplomats, politicians, the term Kurdistan, mostly in the combination of the Kurdistan regional government, stressing that the term of Kurdistan we refer to is A, in Iraq, and B, depends on Iraqi autonomy. And we are here in the second, I would say, important trend of Kurds in the 20th century. People knew about the Kurds. People were aware of them. They were an important domestic factor in all these countries. But the frame of reference was always the so-called nation states they belonged to, and the Kurdish issue was dealt with and is still dealt with, especially in Turkey on behalf of the European Union, as a minority and a minority rights issue. And basically, even after all what happened in the last years, this is the way, the official way, politicians and diplomats treat the Kurdish issue until now. But Kurds at the same time have not been passive, but were organizing themselves. Most importantly, in Iraq, for the simple reason that in Turkey in the 1930s, until from the 20s to the 30s, the suppression of the big Kurdish uprisings was so severe that it took at least 2 generations that anything coming along Kurdish activities could emerge again. But if we compare the situation in Iraq and Turkey, this explains already a lot of the current situation, because in Iraq, first, there was a policy of autonomy based on ethnicity. This was not hostile to Iraqi thinking. This does not mean that the autonomy statuses in Iraq were what the Kurds wanted or what certain Kurdish elites wanted or whether all Iraqis agreed on it, but you had the lawmakers, the concept and the thinking about autonomy with quite modern attitudes. Well, questions like which language to teach in school, which language is it what the police force should use, and so on. And already in the 60s, the Iraqis were thinking about this issue in strictly nationalist terms. So this is about ethnicity, the language issue, and the devolution of power. Arabs on this side, Kurds, and some others on the other side. And in Iraq, of course, the question was where would now be the precise boundaries of this Kurdistan. And here is, in a way, a catch-77 situation, because it starts with the borders of Iraq itself and the famous Mosul and Kirkuk question, which the Ottomans initially refused to cede to the British with the argument that Mosul and Kirkuk don't belong to Mesopotamia. It was the special status of Mosul and Kirkuk was something of kind of a bone of contention between the Turks and the Iraqis, and there was in a way a legal pedigree which made it easier for the Iraqis, or easier to convince the Iraqis to work with models like autonomy. At the same time, the same legacy of belonging or not belonging to Iraq, and don't let us forget, according to Sykes-Picot, Mosul would have been part of Syria. Because of the ethnic, from Mosul eastwards, you have a quite ethnic homogeneous Arab area, tribal area. So it was from an Iraqi perspective also understandable to accept the idea of autonomy there. On the Turkish side, it was often treated as the lost province or the lost provinces where we have been tricked out, because according to their reading of or to one reading of the Misaki Milli, and you could have it 10 years ago, people would come up with the idea again that the national pact of Ataturk would also include, potentially at least, Mosul and Kirkuk. And in the highly nationalist circles in Turkey, you would always hear that Turkey must play a bigger role towards the northern Iraqi areas to relieve and to support the Turkomans in the Kirkuk region. At the same time, from the Kurdish side in Iraq, we all know the emergence of the nationalist movement under Mullah Mustafa Barzani, and the creation of the KDP, then the split of the PUK. These are the most important Kurdish parties in Iraq.
But to explain it a bit, you can't take it as read.
Okay. The KDP, in the 1950s, Kurdish nationalists created the Kurdish Democratic Party, which is still existing, which is one of the most dominant, under Mullah Mustafa Barzani, a hero, scion of a very influential family from Barzan, and basically their aim was a autonomy status for Kurdistan inside Iraq, with the clear borders and responsibilities. And a few years later, you would have a split of a younger generation of politicians, the so-called PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, under Jalal Talabani, and both families until this day play an important role. The overall setting was in a way that the Iranians, for their use, tried to get influence with both the PUK and the KDP, to use them and support them in uprising against the Iraqi states, and the Iraqis did the same thing with the Iranian Kurds. The important thing is now that what the KDP and the PUK did was basically a classic work to create an autonomous region with administration, and following that, potentially independence. I do not want to go too much into detail. The question of Kirkuk was basically the question whether this Kirkuk belongs to Kurdistan or not, the very question which blew up the whole arrangements, because the Kurds would insist on it and Baghdad would always deny it. This is a situation which hasn't changed. So ask any Arab, they would never say that Kirkuk belongs to Kurdistan. Ask any Kurds, there is simply no compromise position possible any longer. There have been compromises worked out, but it boils usually, they were all falling down, and both sides were always trying to put their ethnic group into the better position in this mixed ethnic area. With 2003 and the weakening of the Iraqi government, the Kurdistan region became not only what they have been before, a entity which can meet on the level of deputy ministers, and whose politicians sometimes get an audience with a more important political figure, but they became strategic partners. That's a whole different thing. Until that point, the importance was not so big, but using the Kurdistan as a basis, not necessarily as a basis for intervention, but to know that there is a base of friendly area where the Americans could move, was something where the relationship between the Kurdish parties and the Western international community changed. They were elevated to a more important level. This does not say there was never a promise to create an independent Kurdistan yet, but substantial autonomy. And this and it's very open what the substantial autonomy means, and the Americans hoped back then in 2003 that this will be negotiated with the democratic Baghdad government. That was basically the plan. But this is a classic nation-building process with territory, institutions, and already experience. There was a lot of mistakes which have been done. There was even a civil war in the 1990s. But this is, I would call it, a classic nationalist model. And the critique of this model is not to be efficient enough. For instance, the pressure which has been exerted on both parties to unify their military units, their secret service, and so on. But it is still a model which is very easily and much easier to be understood for Westerners and to stomach than the other model, which I would call the second model, and that is the revolutionary model, represented by the PKK. From the PKK, as I mentioned already, that the Kurds in Turkey were very silent for more than 2 generations because they were still shocked from what was going on in the 1930s. The country was extremely underdeveloped with the inspectorate governorates. It was de facto military rule all the way long in the 1930s to the 50s. There was only a few times of easing. And Kurdishness, although traditional Kurdish elites persisted, their lifestyle was still very conservative. But to put it into a political framework, it was the radical left of Turkey which kind of adopted the idea of the Kurds, and the presentation of Kurds was there as the Kurds as the permanent oppressed ones, domestic colonialization, etc., on this Turkish state. And this interpretation of that Kurdish rights could only be gained by revolutionary action was very widespread, and given the fact that Kurdish elites either were corrupted or silenced or gave up any claim of Kurdishness when they were in the Turkish services. Important figures of Turkey were of Kurdish origin, but they would not claim until the 1990s, would not dare in front of a broader Turkish public to make a point that they are Kurds. So this Turkish denial policy was very total, and the reaction on this was a revolutionary one. In the 1970s, 60s, 70s, especially in the 70s, revolutionary groups jumped out everywhere. Tribal chiefs would then run militias on their own, like the famous Butchak family. It was a highly militarized and brutalized society by the end of the 1970s, until the military made their coup d'etat. And of all these silent, most important groups like KUK was a very important, or Ala Rizgari, they were very important Kurdish left-wing groups which had taken over a lot of the political language, patterns and ideas from the international socialist anti-colonialist struggle. So you would find arguments from Che Guevara to others. This happened all over the region, but it is important to see them in Turkey in this context, because one of these groups which survived because they were outside the country already was called the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK of Abdullah Öcalan. Now the PKK had its own development. It was a small group originally. It was quite a brutal group, and they were in a way lucky not to be in Turkey when the coup d'etat happened, and they could restructure. They could restructure, and you don't do restructure in the Middle East simply in the mountains, but you need a patron. And in this case, the patron was Syria. Very simple. We know the PKK then had built up its first structure in the Bekaa, in the Lebanese area of Bekaa, which is a traditional training ground of pro-Syrian guerrilla groups. They received their ordinary guerrilla training there, but they developed on their own, and given the oppression in Turkey, and given the fact that they were the only ones who came up with any idea and any plan, and with the fact that they managed to strike in the 1980s against Turkish interests, where the Turkish army was so sure that no one else would dare to do anything. So where they kind of broke the taboo, and they insisted on the Kurdishness. So this made this group very attractive and very efficient, and they were able to build up, as very good and gifted organizers, to build up a structure, an organizational structure throughout southeastern Anatolia and in Europe, which was impressive. And the big Serhilda, the big uprising from the late 80s to the early 1990s, the estimates are about 40,000 casualties all in all. I would be careful with the numbers because you don't know on whose responsibility they are. But to be frank, it really hampered the development of Turkey because Turkey had, which was on the way to develop itself as a more liberal, not more democratic, but a more market-based society, had to spend incredible amounts of money and wealth and blood into the region. I remember very well in 93, 94, I was a student in Istanbul, and for the first time people were in a constant denial, but from 93 when I came to Istanbul and 94, 93 people would not talk about the situation in southeastern Anatolia too much, and then it was just not to avoid because you saw the masses of refugees coming in. And what has been a war far away down there somewhere, where the Arabs are and the Kurds, has become an issue in Istanbul and a socialist in Istanbul, and the policies of denial of Kurdishness could not be upheld any longer. This said, the army continued the way it did and had its how should I say, Pyrrhic victories. There were two Pyrrhic victories. One was they broke the neck of the PKK as an organization by simply putting out traditional handbooks of counterinsurgency, which simply means you do the same thing what Saddam Hussein did, round up the people who are alongside the infiltration route and resettle them somewhere, mostly in non-Kurdish areas. The numbers the Turks admit are 150,000. The numbers the Turkish academics insist on, which they can prove, are at least 1,200,000 forcefully expulsed. And the total number the Kurds or Kurdish groups claim is about 3 million, because you have also to think of the effect when you see that the army empties out one village. The next village may decide better to move now on your own terms than to get kicked out. So this is one of the issues which is still debated in Turkey, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, because given the fact that it was an insurgency, population cannot stay neutral. One of the first facts of counterinsurgency is that you do not allow somebody to take no sides. So if you kind of say a village, you kind of easily manage a valley where people say, we get along very well here, we can live with that, the PKK rules the night and the government the day perfectly, just leave us alone and let us, we will manage somehow. A lot of villages did this. But then in a situation of an insurgency, either side, the insurgents and those who fight the insurgent, must not allow neutrality. So this explains the high numbers and the tense situation and the fear. People still talk about, in very shocked terms, about what happened in the 1990s. And at the same time, they saw that in Western Turkey, you see a development, modern development, tourism is coming, wealth is coming, and so on, and can compare it with what happened in the East. And this led to something that the linguistic assimilation often worked very well. So the Kurds would not speak Kurdish again because it was basically their local dialect they spoke, and it was basically the language they used on the countryside, of the farm language. No farms any longer, no farm life any longer, everything is modern, everything is Turkish. But the reaction was also that there was the equation Turkish right-wingers and sometimes the government made, namely to make a Kurd is the same thing like a PKK, is the same thing like a terrorist. People who, the children of those who were forcefully expulsed when they were 5, 6, 7 years old, took over this language and said, well, okay, yes, we are PKK, we are Kurds, and we don't distinguish. Now, given the character of the PKK as a basically communist People's Front thinking organization, where you on your own, because if you run an insurgency, you don't spare too much time on political debate, perhaps a strategy, but you would not allow a second organization, a second political discourse, or a debate emerge around you. So this has, of course, strengthened the identity of the PKK as this tough, quasi, almost Stalinist organization, and which still was fighting and had to retreat. They were militarily defeated, but the idea was still there, the hate was there, and there was, as we always call it, the second volume of the book on counterinsurgency, that is the political process. If the Turks had settled then for the language rights in, say, 95, 96, or at least in 99 when they got hold of Öcalan, then the political demands and the process could have changed. The political discourse would be a different one. Language rights in the sense of in school, in television, and so on. What happened then was a waste of time or a losing time, and it took until the AK Party came to power that more on the still on the symbolic level, but more meaningful steps were done. Meanwhile, Öcalan in prison rethought his position and the position of his organization. His organization was sidelined, but it was not defeated. It was on the margins of the Kurdish movement. Everybody was looking in 2001 to 2003 to the Kurdistan regional government with the prestigious Barzani family at its helm. And Barzanis had a tradition of followers in Turkey, in Syria, and in Iran. But Öcalan, who was rethinking what to do with an organization which has still a fighting capacity, which has still a very efficient European organization, which has still some pockets of organization in Syria, tolerated by the Syrian government, and which realizes that there is no real movement on the Turkish side towards autonomy. And then Öcalan realized something else. With 2003, he said, when the Americans go and destroy such a powerful nation state like Iraq, this opens up opportunities. Whatever there will be, there is no more second Anfal. Don't have to be afraid. At the same time, he was reading.
Sorry, do you want to expand on what was Anfal?
Anfal was in 1988, the Iraqi government was fearing that big massacres, big catastrophe usually start with the sober military analysis, and then they come out totally out of control. They were fearing that the Iranians and Kurdish groups could come via the north and threaten Baghdad directly. The Iran-Iraq war was still in the south, but one means to block mass military forces is to use chemical weapons. This was the first thinking. This was where you put out the genie, the chemical word was out. So you have to think of a group of decision makers who get nervous. What if they come from the north? Well, then the military answer would be, because we need all our divisions in the south, we only have one here, that's not enough. In such a situation of truly or perceived stress, military decision makers go for the ultimate weapon. But the ultimate weapon in this case was the chemical. But since the leadership was not only military, the military people thought of it as a military to block a potential Iranian breakthrough. But as it was also political, the higher leadership of the ruling party, including relatives of Saddam Hussein, said, well, now first we're going to stop them, and we don't only stop them, we go active, we start. And we do it not only to block any potential military threat from Iran, but to teach these Kurds a lesson they will never forget. You see, always go stop a panic, a military scenario, a logical military decision or suggestion, and then these things get out of control. And this was then named Operation Anfal, which costed, I don't know, 100,000 of Kurds their lives. City Halabja was almost destroyed. It was a catastrophe, a human tragedy which was so big, which was thought to be some kind of overkill operations to sideline the Kurdish issue forever, that it raised the ire and the anger of the whole international community. And this was insofar important because this and subsequent events where millions of Kurds fled their homeland to Turkey and to Iran, this had an effect that Kurds everywhere in the world felt solidarity. And what has been a faraway issue, if you're from Erzincan, then Kirkuk and Halabja is really far away. But it was all the memories, and you really could say after Halabja and Saddam Hussein, among the Kurds in Turkey, they were talking with much more assertiveness about issues of taboos, of resettling, about massacres and so on. So this common sense of victimhood was triggered off after the Anfal campaign. What has been for midterm a military and even political success insofar that the Iraqi Kurds were really shell-shocked. They did not expect this brutality. And Saddam, for a few years, really won the game on the military and political field. In the long run, it turned out to totally delegitimize Saddam Hussein as a person and to delegitimize the Iraqi mode of problem resolution. So it was one step too much, because everybody knew that the Iraq of Saddam Hussein was not a human rights paradise, but Anfal was, so to speak, the point too much. Political Machiavellism and realpolitik just doesn't stomach everything. Even if countries continue to deal with Iraq on a diplomatic basis, this was simply too much. However, Öcalan in his prison cell on Imrali Island decided we don't have to be afraid that something like this will happen again, because look where Saddam Hussein has been then and where is he now. So Öcalan ordered a restructuring, and he had to combine very contradictory ideas and thinking. He wrote something which is called the KGK/Messi, officially they disbanded the PKK and called the whole thing the Komachi-Wakan Kurdistan, let's call it Federation or Union of Kurdish Societies. The idea behind was, and I'm very in broad outlines, you don't question the existing borders, but you go for an autonomy where all Kurds would unite and all the Kurdish organizations would come under one roof. So far, so democratic, but then comes the second thing. The PKK is the heart of the whole matter, in two levels, on the ideological level and on the level of the key decision makers. So on one hand, the restructuring should include Islamists, should even include, in a further stage, all the Kurds from Syria, from Iraq, and from Iran. And they should also join the political framework of the PKK. Expectedly, the PUK and the KDP, the two important parties in Iraq, would not like to hear anything, and just took the, as it has been, the renaming of the PKK to KCK, as just a renaming and not as a new concept. But Öcalan insisted, and therefore he let create on two levels, first political parties and then second militias in all countries, not necessarily everywhere with the same intensity, but the idea was the following. You have first a political leadership which sits in Kandil, which is the so-called executive council, which runs like a constitution, like a state, these autonomous entities. You have a political party like the PID in Syria, the PCDK in Iraq, the PJAK in Iran, and none in Turkey, which is very interesting, and I come to that in a minute. Secondly, you organize the society, and there he uses the classic handbooks of how to organize guerrilla movements. He insists that everybody must be in a community, a commune, insists that this project serves that you don't have really a chance to say no to be member of the KCK. Basically, it is a totalitarian system. Every Kurd, per definition, must be member of it in the fitting form. So you're either on your village or in your city. There must be an organization form of the KCK. At the same time, there's no contradiction that political parties would engage in their framework with the nation state they are in. But the real organization should be the KCK, and the parties would be on the outside. And in Turkey, the pro-Kurdish party, now called HDP, has an own pedigree, an own political history, independent, and is not formally part of the PKK structure. I saw no document of the PKK which would indicate that, but they share the same population. You have the support base. So Öcalan was thinking, we organize in all countries our KCK model. We put a frame, a part in front of it as a face, and at the same time, at some selected places, namely Iran, Syria, and in Turkey, which is a total different unit, we create from the main force of the PKK guerrilla, experienced guerrilla groups, troops, which will be active there and which will have and enjoy a high degree of autonomy. But the idea was in both cases that there is a clear chain of command from the official political party to the center in Kandil over the political frame, and from the military groups like the YPG to the command in the Kandil Mountains, where since the 80s, the 90s, the PKK center is situated in northern Iraq. It is therefore not, although they act in parallel, but there are two different chains of command, because the military command of the PKK and the civilian side are different, and in the end it would all meet with the same 10 to 15, 20 people who are in the executive council of the PKK. It's quite a complicated structure, but it's very well revealed, because why it's revealed? For two reasons. There have been processes against the PKK and against PKK membership in both Turkey and in Germany and around, where they deal with the issue of the structure of the PKK. So it's quite very well, and it's a very classic organizational form, complicated, but once one understands it, not so different. And Öcalan thought of this, that this must be topped in the long run. Turkey's nationalism and centralism will be replaced by EU thinking. Once Turkey is a EU member, it will federalize. That would result in a situation where in southeastern Anatolia, Kurdish autonomy is tantamount with PKK rule. Because what he has in mind actually is a People's Front government. So you can't be from all walks of life, from all parties, but it's basically a People's Front government. And when this worked up and down, the Turks misunderstood what they saw for years. But once the Arab Spring came in, things changed dramatically over Syria. Because in Syria, the PKK was enthusiastic that they could build up their structure in the way they wanted. The state was relatively weak. The militias were were checkmating themselves. So in Syria, the PKK started in the form of PYD and YPG to implement this program. This program was implemented step by step with the organizational forms which have been foreseen. The result was then that they started with a unified front organization where they forced everybody in, but the followers of the KDP, the Barzanis, said no. You have to imagine there are 3 tiny cantons. Do we have? Yeah, there are 3 tiny cantons in here in northern Syria. 1, 2, 3. And there they declared an autonomy, and they made 2 messages. One was they call it the Rojava, that's west, but the PKK avoids still to talk about Syrian Kurdistan, which is read from most analysts that the Syrians still have a say in what the PID does in Syria. However, they are scattered. They have no allies in Syria. They have sidelined and kicked out the followers of the KDP in Iraq, who are followers of Barzani and the Kurdistan regional government. As a reaction, the KDP and the KRG blocked the border here. At the same time, the PID told, and the whole PKK media said, this project, as we do in Syria, is the model for Turkey. Now the reaction of Turkey was to be expected, because what they saw was the building up of a parallel state, of a parallel police force, of a parallel military, which they had already, then a second reserve element, and even an intelligence service called Palestine. So once the Turks saw this, the border was even more closed before it has been before, but Turkey perceived it as a real threat. And from this point onwards, we have these 2 challenging models of here nation building, and here build up of an alternative power form. The leader of the PID, Saleh Muslim, understood too late that he needs allies, and it was the US then who managed a cooperation between the Iraqi Peshmergas, the units of the Kurdistan region government, and the guerrilla of the YPG, for one simple reason, because they wanted to avoid that there would be an internal, they needed it also, but they wanted to avoid that there would be too much an internal fight between different Kurdish groups who are especially so ideologically such adversaries. There were then three cities or places which defined the situation of today. The first was Kobane. Kobane was one of these outposts. It was emptied out already from the population, and the Islamic State stormed up and needed it. It needed Kobane, not so much for symbolic reasons, but for wheat. there are important wheat silos around Kobane, and this is what the actual strategic aim was of the Islamic State, because the Islamic State, more or less what the Romans called Arabia Deserta, with central Raqqa, that's around here, a very compact area. So they needed this, and they wanted to drive a wedge between the and control the whole between the Kurdish groups, between one Kurdish enclave and another one, the enclave of Kamishli and the west, in order to control the whole northern area. The Battle of Kobane was a masterpiece of both of PKK propaganda, because it was taken over in the media solely as the reading as it happened from the PKK. The famous women's units fought there, and it was the first defeat of the Islamic State, one could say. The important point was, and here is where the Western and the Kurdish or PKK interests were coinciding, coming along, was that it diverted attention from the Baghdad airport. They fight it about a month in August. There was severe fighting about Baghdad airport, and if that had fallen, so there was an interest, a strategic interest of the U.S. military to have in the media the heroic fight of Kobane, and not the dramatic situation with the meltdown of the Iraqi army around Baghdad airport. The Americans' policies until this day, the following: they told the PID they should take a little bit more distance from the PKK. They have problems in Syria. They should more cooperate. And one of the reasons why, one of the military reasons why they would cooperate, would insist on cooperating with the Peshmergas, was not only that it was a political message. You don't build up a one-party system under our watch. You have to accept others. Others have rights too, other Kurds. The second was that those Peshmergas who came there to fight in Kobane were those who were trained with the necessary equipment to communicate with the US Air Force. You can't just call them with a mobile phone or a walkie-talkie. And the PKK has no capacity of that, but the Peshmerga have, and they are vetted and they are trusted in a way. The second point was then, what the Islamic State did too, was to go after Shingal, or Sinjar here around. Basically, not so much, they couched it in Islamic terms, and the treatment of the Yazidi, the horrible treatment of the Yazidi is well known, but there's a strategic logic inside that. It secures a road from Raqqa to Mosul. So if you secure this area from a communication, what Wheat was in Kobane, from a communications perspective for the Islamic State, or the so-called Islamic State, Sinjar is important for communications. And here we come to the two models. From a Barzani perspective and from a KRG perspective, you do everything to secure Kirkuk. And you have your A-team and the best of your fighters around Kirkuk. Because Kirkuk, from the perspective of Iraqi Kurds, was the place where, for which was the reason why always there was a breakdown in the Baghdad-Erbil relationship. And once you have Kirkuk plus good relations to Turkey, you really can export oil, and we don't talk about a little bit, we talk about a strategic resource. Kirkuk is one of the most strategic oil places in the world. So that would be the last point for economic independence for Kurdistan, provided the oil prices fit, but that's another issue. Once Shingal fell down, because the troops were not motivated enough, they were not good enough, the PKK saw its chance to build up a second base in Iraq, on Iraqi territory, and to live on the and to show their capacity. So on one side, from the center of the PKK, which is around here, I guess it's around here, Kandil, they managed to come here, and of course from Syria they came here, and the mass flight, and they managed to cover the mass flight of the Yazidis. which had then repercussions to the third field, and that is Iran. Once the Yazidi and the treatment of the Yazidis was seen by many of this, and the fight of the PKK against it was seen by many of the Iranian Kurds, they immediately joined and swelled the ranks of the PGAK, or what they call themselves now, the YRK, the Western Kurdistan forces, Yekiden Rojilata Kurdistan. So we have a total mix, a total shifting of the geography where the PKK has a strong dislocation. And now what we see is that on one hand there is a policy more independent, a PKK-based policy under the PID in Syria. There is now a total different bargaining. There is a common framework together with the KRG. There is a restart or an attempt of a restart of the peace process in Turkey. And there is this question of Iran. And there is quite interesting that in this year, the program of the PKK, which has been written in Turkish under the name KCK/Mesi, has for the first time been translated into Persian. In an amendment, the language is a little bit more fitting to Iran. Why? Because the fate of the Yazidi had a strong impact in Iran. There were demonstrations. People say it's the biggest demonstration since 2009. It has been picked up by what is the rest of the old Iranian left. It has been picked up by a lot of people who belong to the minorities like Ahle Haq, who are in the margins of Islam or who feel marginalized, and they were all. There is a new need to debate ethnicity in Iran anyway, but no opposition group came up until now with the program or with the capacity to show this is a program. These are our fighters, this is what we do now, this is what we do tomorrow, this is what we do next year. This is only from the PKK framework. And the Iranian policy towards the Kurdish issue was always a very simple one, to try to embarrass or to threaten or to woo in the important Kurdish parties in Iraq, because they had to rely in the 1980s on Iranian support. So you always can embarrass them to show photos from the 1980s and so on. They know all the Kurdish intelligence and military figures who are important, and at the same time the Iranians help. The Germans do a small shipment, the Iranians do double the big shipment of arms to Kurdistan, simply to prevent the Islamic State to storm on. However, the Iranians know that their ethnicity policy has reached dead end. And this is why the agreement, which is called Kodar, and where the fact that the PKK in its Iranian branch managed to offer an alternative is so dangerous, because everybody knows, depending to their own research, that they have to change their policies towards the minorities, namely getting rid of a security approach, whereas the reality is they can't do other. So they're in dead end. They don't know what to do now. Should we teach languages in school? Shouldn't we? They just don't know. And the human rights situation deteriorates because it is perceived as a security measure. To be sure that there is no one-sided declaration of independence of Kurdistan, the Iranians have deployed a lot of troops. People talk about 1 or 2 divisions to the border, to the Iranian Kurdistan border. Just as a warning, and in the end, try to make a double policy. On one hand, to show the Syrian PKK as heroes who fight in the framework, as the Iranians say, of the Syrian government against the Islamic State. This argument has been picked up by many in Iran, who, reading between the lines, argue that this is the fight of secularist forces against obscure radical Islamists promoting the Sharia. So the Iranians could not challenge the propaganda, because you laud one group condemn the PJAK, and at the same time people used your own propaganda weapon, namely the fight around Kobane and the PID, against yourself. The final point I would make and to conclude by that, this is the classic, I tried to show the competition and on some points cooperation between these two important visions of Kurdistan, which we will see, which will most likely be defined either in Syria or in Iran. We don't know whether the PJAK and their new formed force would fight against the Iranians in the months to come. But there's a third force which is not very articulate right now. It's on the margins, and that's the Kurdish Islamists. And these Kurdish Islamists, as political Islam usually is an alternative, without promoting an alternative, you find it revolutionary, you find it reactionary. But these Islamists, I would say there are three groups actually right now to watch. One is the Iranian group, because it connects to via Zorbol and via the Baluchi wing among the Islamist scholars of Iran, Sunni Islamist scholars of Iran, with the Afghanistan and the Afghan thinking. Many of them, as the sectarians went to the PKK, joined the PKK, many of these radical Sunnis joined the Islamic State. In Iraq, again, it's of the younger generation, very young people, very immature people, one would say, but also with a mix of frustration and about the situation. Many joined the Islamic State, and in Turkey it's almost dramatic, because those who joined the Islamic State have also a milieu where they can rely on, a political milieu. That's the so-called Hüdapar Partisi. It's an Islamist party in eastern Turkey. It's quite influential, and it's the successor of the disbanded Hezbollah movement of Turkey, which is a movement which had the nerve and the power to face down the PKK on many occasions and to go for an own cause. And they are very well connected with radical Islamists in Iraq, among the Kurds in Iraq. And one of the successes of the PKK was to paint and to present the fight around Kobane as a fight between the Islamists against the Kurds. But you also can say it was an inner Kurdish fight, because most troops deployed, most of the experienced ones, especially by the Islamic State around Kobane, were Kurds of all parts of Kurdistan. You find Zaza from Bingöl, quite a lot of them, and you find Kurmanj from Duhok and from Erzurum and so on. So it's quite it's quite a third Kurdish entity coming up, and this in a way dovetails with the general situation where the communist-inspired ideologies, as we would say would be the PKK model, and the nationalist modernizers, as it would be the KRG model, have been run their course and have been replaced by something we call, due to the lack of precise terminology, radical political Islam, today embodied by IS, where Kurdistan would form a province on its own. And I think we have, in the years to come, to accept the fact that we will live not with two political models of Kurds, for Kurds, and about a vision about their Kurdistan, but with three, adding the political Islamists. Thank you.
Thank you. Since I don't know Kurdish, I say Hasan Abashi. Yes, we have some time for questions, or we actually don't. Or you want to stand up a little bit, that's fine. We basically see they might well kick us out in the next moment, but let's start if there are any questions, please. The floor is open.
Comments,
yes,
I guess.
Three questions.
Well, ask the most important one first, and then give the possibility someone else have a
Very
mic.
brief, so you can just...
Yes.
Now, you mentioned there are a lot of Kurds who joined the Islamic State from what we call northern Kurdistan and southern Kurdistan. Do you have any actual figures and data to show how many we are talking about?
ISO exaggerates, they talk about 40,000, that's impossible. There's certainly not 40,000, that's not possible.
Kurds have joined the
Now, I don't believe this number, but this is but they're sizable enough. It's not, the fightings around Kobane are number-wise not so big. But let them be 3,000. If you count some of them from Europe too, all in all.
Kurds joined the Islamic State?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are 3,000 Kurds in the Islamic State. No,
That's an estimation which is still debated. What do you do with people who are bilingual? You know, that's who appear as Kurds, who speak Kurdish, who regard themselves as Kurdish, but at the same time they can pass as Arabs. You know the area, or in Turkey. To the amount that the PKK still has this monopole on, the definition when some of the Yazidis say, no, we are not Kurdish, we are Yazidi because the Kurds are Muslim. It's not that easy to come up with the real number. But from those who are from Turkey, from all over Turkey, there are certainly many thousands in different organizations of the region, but also Turkish Kurds, and the percentage of Turkish Kurds is quite higher.
Okay, and two more questions. Do I have time?
Quickly.
Now, you mentioned there is a linguistic fragmentation between the Kurds, and there's also a political fragmentation to a degree, which I agree with. But to what extent do you think the assimilation policies of Turkey, Iran, and the Arabization campaign, the Turkification of the Turkish Kurds, and we know that sometime in the 20th century, the very word of Kurd was banned in Turkey. And the Kurds were called by the state of Turkey mountain Turks who have forgotten their own language. So the assimilation policy was very severe. To what extent, and in Iran again, up to this day, Kurdish political prisoners are hanged, and they simply don't have any other political right apart from cultural right. To what extent do you think these assimilation policies have had an impact on Kurdish, on that fragmentation of the Kurdish language into different dialects, of people forgetting their own language?
There's no direct correlation between what you say and the fragmentation. The fragmentation has been there before, but there has been one with assimilation. However, this assimilation is often countered, especially in Turkey. It was often a question of education. You assimilate because you're educated, and your children don't speak Kurdish any longer, because what would you do in the village anyway when you're, say, university professor? Just to quote the case I know personally, where both parents are Kurds and the problem of voluntary assimilation is something. First, it is, or what we call in Germany, Bildungsassimilation, assimilation by higher education. There's sometimes a debate how voluntary that is or not, but once, of course, you don't have university education, and look at the Iranian Azeris have the same problem. All their higher education is in Persian, so when they write smart or at least long articles about Azeri nationalism, it's in Persian because that's their university language. The same as command language of the PKK is Turkish still, because the Zazas would and the Kermansh would not, and there are so many who just don't speak Kurdish. However, it backfires because denial of identity means that it backfires. They thought it is all only about the assimilation, and that the assimilation would work. But even Georgian groups who were Islamized speak Georgian to this day in Turkey. So basically the idea is there, and it might have been successful insofar that people don't speak the language any longer, but it's not successful in the sense that the problem is done away. As soon as they say we are Kurds, and it's still a political act if it doesn't matter any longer. But the fragmentation, what I think recently is what the Turks are supporting, is the difference between Zaza and Kermanshah, and there the PKK really made a lot of mistakes, because if you have someone like the former commander of the women guerrilla, Beze Khosat, to complain that she forgot about her native Zaza because she was spending about 20 years fighting within the ranks of the PKK, that's a debate that will come. Where do we teach Zaza? Where do we teach Kermanshah? In which village? And this is also one of the reasons why the priest was. But this is possible. It takes, I mean, coming from an ancestry from a minority ancestry myself, I know that autonomy regulations are possible. You can do that. But for this, you need, of course, a peace and a good governance.
Sure. And final question, if I may. Do I have time?
Well, let's get someone else in,
Sure.
Fanik, and then come back to you, please.
And just picking that point, is it the case that the nationalist approach, the traditional nation-state building, has undercut the PKK? Because, as you just illustrated, that people not talking Kurdish, they're talking Turkish, because the issue is the struggle, the revolutionary struggle to throw off oppression as much as it is national expression. It's undercut from that side. It's undercut by the Islamists as well, because all Muslims are part of the Ummah. So what's this nation-state business?
Yeah, the nation-state business. I would so. The focus of the PKK as a revolutionary force is to organize society. So, and this was something as a model. This worked already with the FLN in Algeria, where you had the French government, the French institutions. But overnight, and this is right now occurring in Diyarbakir and in other places, where you have a parallel police system, and obviously an efficient one, because the drug dealers started to bribe them. They would not bribe them if they were inefficient. So the PKK has already, the youth organization of the PKK is already building up checkpoints. It was the PKK which closed down the open offices, the youth organization of the PKK which closed down the open offices and selling points of Islamic State paraphernalia in Istanbul. Not police. Police was overseeing. So there's already quite, but this is about organizing the society. In Kurdistan itself, in Iraqi Kurdistan, where you have already autonomous structures, it's about institution building, state building. The PKK project is still on the guerrilla, on the very nascent level. It's still on the colored by their experience of uprising. You have to avoid because the nation state is hostile, and the terminology is negative. Öcalan writes only negative about the state, because the state he has in mind is Turkey. For somebody like, let's take any Kurdish politician of mid-rank in Erbil and Suleymaniye. They have to run a hospital. They have to take care of the sewage system. They have to, this is where you need the state as a state. It has to work. It has to. You de-ideologize yourselves. You cannot afford too much ideological luxury, because it's still fragile, it's still not recognized internationally, it's still complicated. The question how to have oil, to sit on oil is one thing, to pay the salaries is another thing. And you see the potential. You have to be careful, but you have to meet ordinary demands, and it's more what you don't talk too much about the big cause and the big issue, whilst when you're from a PKK perspective, and I think this is why Syria is so interesting, because they're now in the middle of both of them. Kandil, the command structure of the PKK, they're guerrilleros since the late 70s. They don't have a responsibility. Salih Muslim has a responsibility to feed the population. So he has to go to Ankara too, because he has to beg Ankara to open the borders. And it's, of course, you can use, from his perspective, running something actually. And if you compare it, 2 years ago he was much more aggressive against Erbil, not because he is himself aggressive. Salih Muslim is the leader of the PID. not because he is himself aggressive again or has a personal grudge against the Barzani, no, but because he has been very strict in the command line of the PKK, and if you're close to Kandil or close to Öcalan, you say something personally insulting against the Barzanis for principal reasons. But he has to work on it now. So you see that in Syria we have already a middle position between the state building project, the de facto state building project of the KRG, and the still underground, mentality-wise underground organizational project in Turkey and now coming to Iran. And the difference is precisely because they are now close to build up real institutions.
Thank you. Any further questions? Please, Tommy.
Do you think there will be an armed uprising in Iran? And what would happen if so by the Kurds?
I think that would be. I don't think so, but clearly the agreement they had from 2011 onwards doesn't exist any longer. There was an agreement, and the Peshawar people were very angry. Basically, it was one of these typically Iranian acts, from the Iranian security, where they would say they do a very smart thing, and for the time being this works, and then things change. What they did was, because what was the problem with the Peshawar, or as they call it, their parallel military organization, was back then the HRK. The Hezin Roshilat of Kurdistan. They managed to plant bombs in Karaj and in Zanjan. This was about 2011. Now, that is Turkish area, Azeri Turkish area. It's not possible, there is no traditional infrastructure sympathetic to anybody Kurdish. I don't know whether there are pockets of exiled Kurds here and there, and whether this, I don't know. But still, by and large, and it is close to Tehran. But once you have one guerrilla group back in Tehran, it would be a major embarrassment. So as long as things happen like a bus burned down or blown up with not too many casualties in Karaj, you can work with the Iranian denial machinery. Something in front of Tehran University will, with the new wave among young Iranians, where there's some kind of nostalgic rehearsal of Che Guevara and all these ideas is ongoing, this is something different. That they would have experienced cadres who know how to move in an oppressive country, and they would be a real alternative, because nobody would join the Islamist Baluchis or any other Islamist group. But this would be an enemy the Iranians were so happy and so convinced they have defeated for generations. This would be their choice. It would be anachronistic, but it would be in this new international new left wave or new anti-imperialist wave. It would be both genuine anti-imperialist. It would be very hard to put the moniker pro-American on them, and so on. So this was their shock. They thought now, by attacking the Kurdish armed group, the DBK, which is operating in Turkey on the border, and the HBG, which is the core militia of the PKK, and getting hold of some higher figures of the PKK, that this enforcing them to sign an agreement. So some of the Peshawar people they detained. The others were then forced to retreat. This was 3 years ago. In 2014, the whole political language of the PKK is formulated by the Peshawar, and it is anti-Iranian in the sense of because of the mass executions they do now. But in principle, it's very anti-Iranian, and the Iranians were surprised. And they were in a situation where they even had to publicly laud the PKK branch of Syria. So they're clearly upwind. They've got higher numbers of volunteers and people joining them. PKK claims that they have now, since Kobane, 16,000 fighters have joined them. I doubt it, but I mean, having sympathies and joining really is something else, because it's there's not a summer camp to get the basic training with the PKK, especially in winter. But even so, they have positioned themselves clearly anti-Iranian, and they are experienced now. They have fighting experience. They have fighting experience from Shingal. They have fighting experience from other places, but they have also quite a ruthless and tactically quite a smart enemy, and that's the Wajah, the intelligence ministry, and the Sabah, the Revolutionary Guards. I hope they won't do it, especially because there seems to be a very false impression within many of these Kurdish activists that Iran would be next. So the nuclear negotiations don't go anyway, most likely. So then there will be war against Iran, and then it will be just like with Saddam Hussein. And they read sometimes any anti-Iranian statement as an encouragement for their position. In the end, the thinking goes, but this is, if you're a revolutionary, if you're a guerrilla, you have to believe you're in the permanent center of attention of world politics, otherwise you won't stand the hardship. And there, from this logically follows an overestimation of your importance and your role on the chessboard of international politics and strategy. If they're smarter and well advised not to appear to be the group which starts ethnic unrests in Iran, because there will be certainly no help from outside.
Thank you. Any further questions? We can allow Haraman another one.
Thank you. I've actually written many more questions, but I'll tell you for one.
Leave them for the pub.
What do you, I mean, you also mentioned political fragmentation between the Kurdish groups. But taking the example of Iraqi Kurdistan, where we know KDP and PUK since the 1970s have repeatedly swapped places over between Turkey and Iran. So sometimes Iran has supported the PUK, and then KDP has been supported by Turkey, and then a few years later something has happened, they have swapped positions.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think, from that perspective, do you think the Kurdish issue somehow has been the victim of this rivalry between Persian and Turkish, larger nationalism, larger powers? Do you think the Kurds have been squeezed in that middle? I mean,
being a nation means precisely overcoming this.
Sorry?
Being a nation means precisely overcoming this, this attitude, I'm the victim of something. This is the Italians were, we're the victim of the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, and we're not united and so on. But the answer of nationalism was, we cannot do it on our own. Whether we are former Habsburgian, former Bourbonian, former Tuscan, whatever, we do it on our own. But I think what really changed after the civil war between the PUK and the KDP in the 1990s was that no Kurdish group can afford to shoot Kurds. This is the first time in history. And this is really the leap forwards. And that Kurds, in spite of all their differences, feel a unity. Now, look at the political structure and the people how they were socialized. The group in Kandil are old people, basically. What is the relationship between Cemal Bayek? What does he know actually how the life of an ordinary young Kurd from Turkey is now? He doesn't know it. He still, when you read his interviews, in Turkish mostly, you really get confused. What does he talk about? This is not the case any longer. They know a lot, but this is something like, or we have been always attacked as Orientalists, that we write about people and so on, have never been there and don't know. And that's what happens with isolation. The ideas, the tricks, the political scheming, you really can sense that Masoud Barzani is the last generation of a typical of this old guerrilla Peshmerga tradition. Now the families in the US, they have studied something else. They know Iran, many of them still know Iran, but nobody of them was growing up in a refugee camp in Karachi or in Urmia. This has changed so dramatic. Of course, when important changes take place, the politicians are the last one to realize them. I always believe that they're in the driver's seat. But so many things have changed. On the ground in Shingal, the restructuring was of the fighting. The PKK, of course, classic said, all under our command. The KDP said no, the Peshmerga said no, never. And Kamel Shesha said, I'm the only Yazidi here, so I'm in charge of everything. The result was that the troops just cooperated with all their problems, but they cooperated. But this is new. I mean, if you just read the Iranian literature about Kurdistan from Sheikh Attar, Tarikh Kordova Kurdistan. Sheikh Attar was the former ambassador of Iran to Germany, and he was a responsible governor who received all the Kurdish refugees in the 80s, and he had a very, very gifted and talented young Bakhshdor, a district commander under the name of Ahmadinejad, and a very young and very inexperienced and nervous, he told me, revolutionary guardist with the name of Qasem Soleimani to his disposal, and he met and received, and received these Kurdish refugees like Hoshir Zebari and Masoud Barzani and all them. These days are simply over. They write about them, yeah, and then we use them against the Qasem law, and the Qasem law said, well, Anfal, mass gas, no, Saddam Hussein was using tear gas, perhaps, and so on. These days are over. There's the education and the impact of the diaspora on the broader Kurdish educational level is impressive. Not only from Tehran and Ankara and Baghdad any longer, but Berlin, London, Paris are centers of Kurdish family. In the old tricks, you see it even with the Institute Kurd, where you had the old traditional gentlemen with Nazan Kendal and so on. But the younger generation is simply more educated. They just know more. They just speak more languages. You meet so many who speak 5 languages fluently. At least as soon as you convince them that Sasa is an own language, then it's 3. Well, it's impressive. And this changes. However, there are certain factors which can undo and unravel these changes. One is mismanagement of the KRG as a state. The state in the sense that you can make your fortune there, not depending on the relationship and the family and the tribal background. There, I think, is a problem, because we see it already with a lot of Kurds who return from KRG territory to Germany. And their complaints have nothing to do with politics, but with not so good governance, let's formulate it politely. Second would be if the peace process in Turkey goes down. There is simply no alternative. And the only reason why there is still a peace process which doesn't work is because there is no alternative. Neither the Turkish state, nor the Kurdish organizations, nor let alone the population can afford another Sahildan. It's too brutal. What happened there, you can't, it's just over. Especially since everybody saw there's a possibility to make money with ordinary tourism and to remain Muslim at the same time. People saw that already. That you can, people know already much more that you can very well use your own local language in an administration also. But if these 2 factors break down totally, then I think much of the positive efforts have been in vain. But again, the most important fact is that there is a new relationship among the Kurdish parties, and I think also 10 years ago when when I was in Erbil, they did not want to talk about it, but of course you have 2 armies and 2 secret services and 2 police forces, and the one in green and the one in red. Today, even people who have high functions in these units would say, well, it's a little bit embarrassing because it's the party color still. But and with the influx, look at how many former PKK fighters are now in high position within the Peshmerga. The consciousness is bigger already than this partisanship. And I think this is what is needed now, and what I hope the Western help in the KRG and the military help ends up with a good security sector reform with all the program which is needed, democratic oversight, bylaws, and so on. And of course a modern military academy and so on. It's possible. The chance is there now.
Oh, thank you very much, Walter. One question to bring us back to history, perhaps from my side. Because you spoke about the third force that is now on the horizon, the sort of Islamist Kurdish force. To what degree did sort of Islamist concerns, if one can call them that, played a role in the uprisings like Ubaydullah Khan, or the 1925 uprising in the Turkish Republic?
No, I don't think that this is what we understand now with Islamism. I think that the kind of Islamism, Ubaydullah was still, yes, he wanted more Sharia and so on, but this is still traditional.
But are they not reacting also to the sort of secularizing developments in the late Ottoman state and certainly
secularizing developments, yes, but I think the Islamism. What I think is now the problem is an Islamism which saw already everything failing. You saw the Ba'ath system failing. You saw all these kleptocratic regimes failing, and you don't develop an alternative, so you rely on Said Qutb or whoever, right? But it's not the real program. Ubaydullah Khan was too tribal in a way, still, and what the Sheikh Said uprising regards, it was already very nationalist. It was already very nationalist. It was perhaps immature, but it was already very nationalist. There was a very good critique on the nationalist thesis of Sheikh Said, but it was a necessary revision. It was not so romantic. It was not so modern. But in the end, it was perhaps more in the direction No, it was more. It was as nationalist as it was Islamist. But this Islamism this is our mode of life. It is conservative, which we want to defend. This is not what this new form is, which says we have to break down everything and destroy everything which has been existing. And it was not Wahhabi. None of them had any traces which goes back to Wahhabi or Salafi thinking, which is what the new radical Islam, which is also what poses the problem for the Europeans or the West in general as a concept, because the way we approach Islam is the art historians start with Alhambra and say, what a beautiful mosque and so on. But this means nothing to the radical Islamists. This is a conservative attitude and so on, where you can connect. You can connect with the Iranians even on this point, but not with this new form of Islamism. It's different. And I think, in spite of all the tons of papers and thousands of millions of pages written about it, it's still understudied in a way, or we don't ask the right questions. Why would German Germans call themselves Abdullah, go to the Islamic State, and they're there and do horrible things sometimes? And when we see the numbers of those who come from Central Europe, I don't know about Britain, neither in number nor in social composition, but they're young, they're incredibly young, many of them, 16, 14. What we have in my hometown, for instance, the radicalization for the Islamic State goes in the direction of the 14, 15-year-old. Watching these gruesome videos and so on. So there's something new, and I would put it's. I don't know whether I can call this a politics. Ubaydullah and Sheikh Said, yes, this was classic Islamic. They wanted more Sharia. They reacting on tendencies they didn't like. But what is now ongoing, with this focus on brutality is something new. Not even in the, I don't even remember the worst days of the Islamic Revolution in Iran have been so, well, they were quite brutal.
Right, well, on that sober note, I'm afraid we need some good fortifying drinks, and there we leave it. Please watch the MIHAN